In a high-end restaurant nestled on a busy city street, the evening was in full swing. The clink of glasses and the hum of conversations filled the air as the doors opened. A distinguished elderly black woman entered. She moved with quiet grace, her steps deliberate though slow. The soft click of her cane on the polished floor reverberated throughout the room. Most of the patrons barely glanced at her, caught up in their own conversations and the bustle of the busy evening, but the young waiter who was stationed near the entrance noticed her immediately, his eyes scanning her figure for only a split second before he looked away dismissively. She was not the type of customer he typically served. His mind already formed an impression of her, someone old and frail, someone who probably didn't belong in such an upscale establishment. She was not dressed in the trendy clothes the other guests wore. Her attire was simple and modest, but still elegant. There was a dignity to her presence, a quiet authority that was hard to ignore, yet the waiter chose to disregard it as he continued his task without giving her more than a fleeting thought. The woman paused just inside the door to take in her surroundings. The elegant chandeliers hanging from the ceiling reflected the soft light that bathed the entire room. The tables were filled with well-dressed patrons, laughing and talking over the clinking of fine china and crystal glassware. She stood still for a moment, as though allowing herself to absorb the atmosphere of the place, before taking a slow step forward, her cane tapping gently. With each move she took, the restaurant staff continued to bustle around her, none stopping to offer a greeting or even a glance. After a brief pause, she walked to the host's stand where the young waiter stood, pretending to be busy organizing a small stack of menus. When she approached, he looked up quickly, an impersonal smile barely curving his lips as he asked the expected question, "Do you have a reservation?" She met his gaze, her eyes steady and calm. "No, I don't," she replied, her voice clear and unshaken. The waiter looked her over again with subtle judgment. She wasn't a regular guest. No one in the room seemed to notice her, yet the waiter sized her up, as if to say she didn't belong here. A brief hesitation crossed his face as he glanced over his shoulder, looking for a free table. He was irritated at the thought of accommodating a customer who wasn't on the list. He could feel the shift in his role, the slight annoyance of having to extend courtesy to someone he considered beneath his attention. Still, he pointed vaguely toward the back of the room. Without saying much at all, the elderly woman nodded slowly, and without protest, she turned and began walking to the table he had indicated. The young waiter returned to his work, seemingly satisfied with the minimal service he had just provided. He hardly looked back to check if she had settled in or if she was comfortable, but the woman didn't need his attention. She moved to the table without complaint and sat down with quiet grace, her cane resting beside her. The chair she was offered was far from the other guests, isolated in a corner of the restaurant, but she didn't mind. She had learned long ago that space was something she could navigate alone. It was the judgment of others that she would not tolerate, yet she did not speak of it. As the restaurant continued its busy rhythm, the elderly woman sat in silence, observing the scene around her. Unnoticed by most of the people who had come for their meals, she could see the way the staff moved about with a sense of purpose, and the way they subtly avoided looking in her direction. It didn't bother her, though it had been the way of the world for many years now. She knew better than to expect anything different, and yet the calm determination that came with years of experience had allowed her to remain unaffected. She waited quietly, her patience unfolding with each passing moment as the young waiter moved about the room, unaware of the storm quietly brewing just beneath the surface. The woman sat quietly at the table, the edges of her mouth lifted ever so slightly as she took in the scene around her. The restaurant was busy, but not overly crowded. The murmur of voices blended with the soft music playing in the background, creating an atmosphere of comfort for those who were fortunate enough to belong. She had been here before, not often, but she had visited this very place with her son many times in the past. They had sat at tables with grand views and received attentive service. Her son had built this restaurant from the ground up, but tonight she was alone, and there was no luxury in being left to observe the elegance from a distance. She sat in the corner watching the other guests who were engrossed in their meals and conversations, their laughter rising above the background noise. As the waiter moved swiftly between tables without a second glance at her, he was focused on those who commanded his attention, the important people, the ones who belonged here, the ones who were seen and acknowledged. But she was invisible to him. She had been invisible to many for a long time, yet her presence in the restaurant was not an accident. She had chosen this place deliberately to remind herself of something she had almost forgotten, a connection she had nearly lost with the world she had once been part of before things had changed. Her hands rested in her lap, folded neatly, the tips of her fingers lightly touching one another as she took in the dishware that had been set before her. The plate was too large for the small portion of food. It held the soup, a dull color that could not entice the senses, the salad wilted and unappealing. But she didn't complain. Instead, she observed it with a quiet patience, as though she were studying something unfamiliar with no expectations of what it should be. It was a strange thing for her to be so detached in such a place that her son had created to bring people together, to experience something beautiful, to dine with comfort and elegance, yet here she sat alone, distanced from that world. She had once known the food in front of her seemed more like a symbol than a meal. It represented the difference between the way the world saw her and the way she had learned to see herself. As the waiter passed by again, he looked at her, but only briefly, his eyes darting over her with a clear look of distaste before he continued his path. The small judgment he passed on her was not unique. It was something she had encountered time and time again throughout her life, the way people looked at her, with assumptions written in their eyes, but it was different now, different, because she knew the truth, she knew the power she carried without needing to announce it to anyone. She had carried this strength in silence for years. She let her gaze drift over the room again, her eyes landing on the people around her, who were engaged in their own lives, wrapped in the stories of their evening, unaware of the woman sitting quietly in the corner of the room. The staff continued to bustle about, but their movements had begun to shift subtly, as though an invisible thread connected them to her presence. Their quick glances and hushed whispers did not escape her notice, but she chose to remain silent and still waiting for what was to come next. The young waiter eventually returned with the empty plate, his eyes quickly scanning the table before he leaned forward and asked if she needed anything else. The words were curt and dismissive, but she met his gaze without flinching as she softly shook her head no. The waiter nodded awkwardly and left without another word, not noticing the quiet determination in her eyes or the way the air around them had subtly changed. The waiter moved away quickly as though relieved to have finished with the elderly woman. His footsteps quickened as he returned to the more bustling part of the restaurant, where the chatter and laughter were louder, where the more important guests sat unaware of the quiet exchange taking place in the corner of the room. The woman sat still as he retreated, her gaze never leaving the scene around her, her eyes following the staff as they moved back and forth between tables. Her patience never wavered. She had been in situations like this before, had endured moments of being overlooked and dismissed. She had learned long ago that some battles were not worth fighting with words but with silence. She glanced at the empty plate in front of her, the food untouched, barely worth mentioning, but the gesture of leaving it had not escaped her notice. It was a silent rebellion against the indifference of the service. She did not need to raise her voice to make her dissatisfaction known, and she would not let the poor quality of the meal or the disrespectful treatment by the waiter break her composure. Instead, she would wait and see how the evening unfolded. For now the room was filled with noise, but she remained in her corner, a figure in the background. Time passed and the waiter came and went, attending to other tables, serving meals with efficiency and a subtle smile that seemed absent when he approached her. His interactions with others were full of energy, a stark contrast to the barely there service he had given her. The woman noticed the difference, not with resentment, but with a quiet understanding of how the world worked. It had always been this way for people like her. In places like this they were invisible until they were needed, until their presence could be used as a symbol of success or a reason for a photo op. But she had never been someone who needed to be seen to know her worth. As the minutes stretched into longer periods of time, the woman found herself almost lost in the rhythm of the restaurant, the hum of voices becoming a sort of background music as she waited, her thoughts drifting like the whispers of the staff around her. She knew what they were saying. She could hear the way they spoke in hushed tones when they passed by her table. She had grown used to this sort of thing, being an unwelcome presence in places she had no business being, but she was not bothered. She had long ago learned how to carry herself with grace in situations that others might have found uncomfortable. The waiter returned again, not long after his last trip. This time his attitude was more impatient, as if his mind was on other things. As he leaned in close to take away the empty plate, his words were clipped and uninviting. "Is there anything else you need?" he asked, his eyes barely meeting hers as he stood waiting for an answer. She took a moment before responding slowly. "No thank you," she said, her voice calm and steady. She offered no further comment, no complaint, only a simple answer that left him no room for further interaction. He nodded awkwardly and walked away again, his steps quicker this time, as if he couldn't wait to be away from her table. The woman watched him go, her mind already moving on from the brief interaction. She was aware of the way the other guests had been served with such attentiveness, the way their plates were filled with care, and their glasses refilled, as if they were royalty. She could feel the difference between how she was treated and how others were made to feel important, but she didn't let it affect her. She had learned that there were many things in life that would never change, and this was just another reminder of that fact. She turned her attention back to the rest of the room, letting the hum of conversation wash over her as she waited for what would come next. The room continued to buzz with energy as the elderly woman remained seated at her corner table watching the ebb and flow of the restaurant around her. The hum of voices grew louder as more guests arrived, and the staff moved quickly between the tables. The waiter she had interacted with earlier seemed to have found his rhythm again, serving others with a false air of efficiency, but it was clear to her that the energy he was putting into his service was not being directed her way. She could sense the shift in the room, a subtle change in how the staff viewed her, as though they had collectively decided she didn't belong in this space. She sat in silence, letting the moment pass. She had become used to this type of treatment over the years. It was familiar to her how people would pass judgment based on appearances or assumptions, but it no longer bothered her in the way it once had. As time went on, she had learned to carry herself with dignity and grace in situations where others might have faltered. But tonight felt different. She could feel the weight of the gaze, the glances that were cast her way as the young waiter passed by, once more his eyes meeting hers for a fraction of a second before he quickly looked away. The conversation from the nearby tables became louder as the evening wore on. The clinking of silverware and glasses filled the air, but still there was a slight unease that lingered in the atmosphere. The young waiter's movements had become less fluid and more rigid as he passed her table, each time his eyes lingering on her for a split second, as if he was trying to figure out who she was or why she was there. The discomfort in his posture was unmistakable, but the woman remained unfazed. She could hear his whispered conversation with another server near the bar, their voices low, but not low enough for her not to overhear. She knew that they were talking about her. They were making judgments about her age, her appearance, and most likely her presence here. She could hear their laughter in their tone, and she could almost feel the weight of their words, though they were not directly aimed at her. She had encountered this before, this quiet judgment that people like her faced every day in spaces where they were unwelcome or unseen. The young waiter's voice carried through the air, a touch louder now. It was a casual remark about her appearance followed by a brief chuckle, and the woman's eyes narrowed slightly as she listened. Her fingers tightened around the edge of the table as the waiter's laughter echoed in her ears. But she held her composure. She had dealt with much worse in her life than the careless whispers of a young man who did not know her story or her worth. She had learned to rise above the judgment of those who did not matter. For a moment she wondered whether she should make herself known to them, but the thought passed just as quickly as it arrived. She was not here to prove anything to anyone. She had no need to confront the waiter or the staff. She could sense that this was not a moment that needed an immediate response. Instead, she decided to take a different approach. She would wait patiently and let the situation unfold as it would. She would allow them to feel their discomfort, their ignorance, and when the time was right, she would show them the power of patience and resolve. The waiter approached once more, this time with an air of hesitation. He stood next to the table for a moment before awkwardly asking if there was anything else she needed. His voice was strained now, trying to sound professional, but the unease in his tone was clear to her. She met his gaze slowly, her expression unchanged, and with a soft shake of her head, she replied, "No thank you," she said, her voice gentle but firm. And as he walked away, his footsteps quicker than before, she knew that things were about to change in a way he would not expect. The waiter retreated once more, his footsteps echoing in the quiet space as he hurried back to the safety of the busier tables. The elderly woman remained seated in her corner, not moving or reacting, but her mind was sharp and clear, her patience unbroken. She could feel the shift in the air, the subtle tension that hung around her presence. As the evening continued, the staff moved more awkwardly as they passed her table, their eyes darting away when they met hers. It was as if they were suddenly unsure of how to behave in her presence, as if they had underestimated her, but she gave no indication that she had noticed the change. She could hear the low murmurs of the staff from across the room, their words drifting toward her like whispers carry on the air. They spoke in hushed tones, but she could catch fragments of their conversation. She heard the young waiter telling one of his colleagues that something about the woman didn't sit right with him. He couldn't quite place it, but there was an odd feeling in the pit of his stomach as he tried to process why he had been so dismissive of her. It was a subtle shift in his attitude, but the woman could tell it was there. She could sense the discomfort in him, the unease that now colored his every movement, and for a moment she felt a flicker of satisfaction at the effect her presence had on him. It wasn't anger or bitterness. She felt it was simply the awareness that things had shifted, that she had become more than just a shadow in the corner of the room. She had taken up space in a way that couldn't be ignored. It was a quiet kind of power, one that didn't require loud words or grand gestures, but instead just a simple presence that commanded attention without asking for it. She had seen this happen before in other places with other people, and now it was happening again. As the waiter went about his duties, he stole glances in her direction, his body language tight, as if he were waiting for something to happen. The discomfort in him was evident, but he didn't know what to do with it. He had thought he could dismiss her. He had thought she was just another inconsequential customer, someone who wouldn't make waves, but now he felt a growing unease that gnawed at him as he went from table to table, unable to shake the feeling that something was wrong. The woman remained still, watching his every movement. She could see the tension in him, the way he moved quickly to avoid looking at her, his steps becoming more hurried as he served others, but never quite meeting her gaze. She had long ago realized that people who lived in fear of others who treated them with disdain often carried a deep-seated insecurity that they tried to mask with arrogance and indifference, and she could feel that same insecurity emanating from him as he tried to keep up the pretense of being unbothered by her presence. She knew that this was only the beginning, that soon enough the truth would come to light, and when it did, the shift in the room would be undeniable. But for now she remained patient, watching the waiter as he fidgeted and moved between tables, his once confident demeanor crumbling under the weight of his own discomfort, and the woman smiled to herself, the quiet satisfaction of knowing that sometimes the best way to handle such situations was not to fight back, but to wait until the right moment arrived, when everything would fall into place without any effort at all. Time passed and the waiter's movements became even more hurried as the evening wore on, but the woman did not break her composure. She simply watched and waited, knowing that soon enough everything would unfold the way it was meant to, and the power she had quietly held in that moment would become clear to everyone around her. The woman sat unmoving, her eyes still locked on the waiter, who was now visibly uneasy, his movements more erratic than before, his steps faster as he dashed between tables, pretending to remain composed, but his discomfort was palpable. It wasn't the food that bothered him or the pressure of serving the other guests. It was her presence that unnerved him, that quiet force that had settled into the room, and he couldn't shake it. No matter how hard he tried, his mind kept returning to her calm demeanor, the way she seemed so unbothered by everything around her, even the cold treatment he had given her earlier. As the evening stretched on, the restaurant remained bustling, the chatter of guests rising and falling with the ebb and flow of service, but there was a shift in the atmosphere, a subtle undercurrent that the other guests seemed unaware of, but the staff certainly did not miss. They began moving differently, glancing toward the woman as they passed, their movements now laced with hesitation, as if they too had begun to question why she was there and whether they should have treated her differently. The young waiter couldn't quite focus on his tasks. His eyes kept drifting to the woman in the corner, his thoughts jumbled as he tried to make sense of the situation. He had never seen her before. He had no idea who she was, but something about her told him she wasn't the kind of person to be brushed aside so easily. Yet he had done exactly that. His mind raced as he tried to ignore the nagging feeling in the back of his mind that told him he had made a mistake. He had underestimated her, and now the weight of that mistake was beginning to settle on him like a heavy burden. Meanwhile, the woman remained unaffected by the growing tension around her. She knew exactly what was happening. She could feel the shift in the energy of the room, the way the staff had become more self-conscious, more aware of their actions, as if they could sense that something was about to unfold. But they didn't know what yet. They only knew that they had been caught in a web they didn't understand, and it was only a matter of time before the truth would come to light. She leaned back in her chair, ever so slightly, her posture still dignified, her hands resting calmly in her lap. She was a woman who had lived through much more than any of them could possibly understand, and she knew that sometimes the best way to teach a lesson wasn't with words but with patience, with waiting for the right moment to reveal the truth, to allow the pieces to fall into place without forcing them. She had done this countless times before, and tonight would be no different. The waiter returned again, this time his expression even more tense than before, his body language stiff as he approached her table, his movements hesitant as though he wasn't sure what to expect from her. He stood there for a moment, silently waiting for her to acknowledge him, but she did not. She remained seated as if she hadn't noticed him at all, her gaze fixed on something across the room as though she were deep in thought. The young man shifted uncomfortably on his feet, his voice trembling slightly as he finally spoke. "Is there anything else I can get for you?" he asked, his words coming out strained and forced, but still she said nothing. The silence between them stretched for several long moments, and just when the waiter thought he could no longer bear the weight of it, she finally looked up, her eyes meeting his with calm intensity, and for the first time in the evening, he felt a flicker of something different in her gaze, something that made him feel small and unimportant, something that made him wish he had never treated her with such indifference. But it was too late now. The moment had passed, and all he could do was stand there waiting for her to speak. But she didn't respond right away. Instead, she simply looked at him with a steady gaze that seemed to pierce through him, as if she were waiting for him to say something else, to admit the mistake he had made, to acknowledge the discomfort that he had caused. But still he said nothing, and in that moment the woman smiled softly to herself. She knew that the time had come for the truth to reveal itself. The young waiter stood frozen in place, his mind racing as the elderly woman's gaze continued to hold him there like an invisible force, pinning him to the spot. He had been prepared for a simple exchange, but instead he found himself in a moment he could not control. Something was unfolding, and he couldn't make sense of it. His breath caught in his throat as the woman's silence stretched on, her eyes never leaving his face, her expression calm. But there was something about the stillness that made him feel small and exposed. He had expected impatience, anger, even, but she offered none of that. She only watched him silently waiting. The rest of the restaurant seemed oblivious to the scene unfolding in the corner of the room. The sounds of clinking silverware and low conversation continued as usual, but there was a palpable shift in the air around the young waiter. He could feel the weight of the woman's presence and the discomfort it was causing him, but he couldn't bring himself to look away. Her steady gaze seemed to hold him in place, his legs feeling like lead beneath him, his mind racing for an escape. But there was nowhere to go. The truth had already begun to unfold in a way he wasn't prepared for. The silence between them stretched longer than he thought possible, and finally he found his voice, although it was shaky and unsure. "I'm sorry," he muttered barely above a whisper, his words fumbling out in a way that made him wish he could take them back before they were even spoken. But the woman didn't react. She simply continued to look at him, waiting for more, waiting for something that he couldn't quite put into words. It was as if the weight of his mistake had caught up to him all at once, and now he was being forced to confront it in a way that he wasn't prepared for. The uncomfortable truth of the situation was hanging between them in the air, and he knew there was nothing he could do to undo what had already been done. The woman finally broke the silence, her voice soft but carrying an undeniable weight. She didn't need to raise her voice to make her point. She didn't need to yell or make a scene. She had already said everything that needed to be said, without uttering a single word. "Your apology is too little too late," she said, her tone calm but firm, and in that moment the young waiter realized the depth of his error. He had judged her based on assumptions he had never bothered to question, and now that same judgment was turning against him. The words hit him like a slap across the face. They stung with the truth of his actions, and for the first time since their interaction began he felt a deep sense of shame. He wanted to apologize again, to explain himself, to somehow make it right, but he didn't know how. The woman's calm demeanor left him feeling exposed, his own insecurities laid bare in front of him. The woman looked at him for a long moment as if assessing his sincerity, her gaze unwavering, her hands still resting gently on the table before her. She had seen it all before: the arrogance of youth, the presumptions of those who thought they knew. The young waiter stood before her, unsure of what to do next. His mind was a tangled mess of confusion and regret, his hands fidgeting at his sides as he glanced nervously around the room. But there was no escape from this moment. He couldn't ignore the woman any longer. He couldn't just walk away and pretend like nothing had happened. He had made a mistake, a big one, and the consequences of that mistake were staring him in the face. The elderly woman continued to sit in her chair, unmoving, her posture regal, her expression calm, but there was a quiet intensity in her eyes that made the waiter feel as though he were under a microscope, as if she could see straight through him to the very core of his being. The silence between them was heavy, like a thick fog that refused to lift no matter how hard he tried to shake it off. He had thought he could get away with his judgment, his dismissal of her, but now the weight of it was crushing him. The woman didn't speak again. She didn't need to. She had already said everything she needed to say without uttering another word. Her silence was louder than any reprimand could have been, and the young waiter found himself searching for an explanation, something that could redeem him in her eyes, but he couldn't find the words. He couldn't bring himself to make excuses. He knew deep down that he had no right to justify his actions, no matter how hard he tried. Finally, the manager of the restaurant appeared at the young waiter's side, his presence a sudden interruption to the tense moment. The manager had been watching from a distance, aware of the growing tension between the waiter and the elderly woman, but unsure of how to intervene. He stood there for a moment before addressing the woman with a courteous smile. "Good evening, ma'am. Is everything to your satisfaction?" he asked, his voice warm and professional, but his eyes flickered nervously between the woman and the waiter, sensing the unease that had settled over the table. The woman looked up at the manager for the first time since he had approached her. Her gaze never wavered as she met his eyes. She smiled slightly, but there was a subtle edge to it that made the manager pause for a moment, as if sensing that he was walking into a situation he didn't fully understand. "Everything is fine," she said, her voice smooth, but her tone held something more than just politeness. She had already made her point. She didn't need to explain herself further, but her words lingered in the air, as if daring the manager to probe deeper into what had transpired. The manager hesitated before speaking again. "I apologize for the delay in service, ma'am," he said, but the woman waved him off with a small gesture of her hand. "There was no need for an apology," she said, her voice still calm and steady, but her eyes locked on the young waiter now standing at a distance watching her with wide eyes as though he was unsure of what to expect next. The manager glanced back at the waiter, then returned his attention to the woman. "I'm sure there's been some misunderstanding," he began, but the woman cut him off with a soft shake of her head. "There is no misunderstanding," she said, her tone firm and direct. She let the words hang in the air between them for a moment before she added simply, "You need to speak with him," referring to the young waiter, who was now shifting nervously from one foot to the other. The manager looked between the two of them uncertainly, but he knew the woman was right. He had witnessed enough to know that the issue was not with the service, but with the behavior of the waiter himself, and he could see that the woman was not going to let it slide without addressing it. He turned toward the waiter, his voice stern as he spoke to him quietly. "Come with me," he said, and the young waiter followed reluctantly, his head lowered in shame as he moved toward the back of the restaurant. The tension in the air was palpable as the manager led him away, and the elderly woman watched them go, her eyes never leaving the scene, her mind already moving past the moment, knowing that the waiter had learned a valuable lesson, one he would not soon forget. But she wasn't done yet. There was still one more thing she needed to do before the evening was over. The woman sat in silence as the manager and the young waiter disappeared into the back of the restaurant, her eyes still fixed on the path they had taken. She could feel the weight of the moment lifting ever so slightly, knowing that the young waiter had been called to account for his actions. But she wasn't done yet. She had made her point to him, but there was still one final piece to this puzzle. She had waited patiently for this moment to come, and now it was time for her to do what needed to be done. She wasn't the type to seek out confrontation, but there were times when the right thing to do was to make sure the lesson wasn't just for one person, but for everyone in the room. Her mind wandered for a moment back to the years she had spent working in places like this. She had encountered countless people like the waiter, young, arrogant, and quick to judge based on appearances. She had seen how people like him looked at her and others like her with that same dismissive air, as though they were above the struggles of those who didn't look like them, didn't fit the mold of what they thought belonged in spaces like this. But over the years, she had learned that sometimes the best way to handle people like him was to let them come to their own realizations, to allow them the space to see their own flaws for themselves without pushing too hard. As the minutes passed, she could hear the soft murmur of conversation in the restaurant continuing as if nothing had happened. The staff had settled back into their routines. But there was a subtle change in the air, a sense of unease lingering in the background. She could feel the eyes of the other servers occasionally glancing her way. Some of them had noticed the exchange between her and the waiter, and they were now watching with a mix of curiosity and apprehension, wondering what would happen next. The manager's voice echoed from the back of the restaurant as he spoke to the young waiter, but the conversation was too distant for her to make out the words. She could only guess at what was happening back there. Eventually, the manager returned to the front of the room, his expression more serious than when he had left. The young waiter was nowhere to be seen, but the woman could feel the shift in the atmosphere around her. The staff was now more aware of her presence, their movements a little more cautious as they went about their duties. The manager approached her table and stopped just a few feet away. He stood there for a moment, taking in the situation, before finally speaking. His voice was low, but respectful. "Ma'am, I'd like to apologize again for the way you were treated tonight," he said, his eyes meeting hers with a sincerity that hadn't been present earlier. The woman looked up at him, her gaze steady but not unkind. She nodded slowly as if acknowledging his words, but she wasn't ready to let this go. "Not yet. Thank you for your apology," she said, "but the problem is much bigger than one waiter's mistake. It's about the way people like me are treated every day in places like this. It's about the assumptions made, the judgments passed without a second thought, and the way that kind of behavior gets brushed aside like it's nothing more than a minor inconvenience." The manager's face softened as he listened to her words. He had been expecting an angry outburst or a bitter complaint, but instead he was met with something far more powerful, a calm assertion of truth that carried more weight than any raised voice ever could. He had thought he could handle the situation with a quick apology and a few words to smooth things over, but now he realized that he had underestimated the woman's experience, the depth of her understanding, and the impact of her presence in the room. He was learning a valuable lesson in humility, and it wasn't lost on him that this was exactly the kind of lesson that needed to be shared with everyone who had witnessed what had just unfolded. "I'll make sure this doesn't happen again," he said, his voice firm now but still carrying that undercurrent of regret. "I'll speak with the staff and ensure that everyone understands the importance of treating all our guests with respect and dignity. You have my word that this will be addressed." The woman nodded again, her expression unreadable for a moment, but then she smiled slightly, not a smile of happiness, but one of acknowledgement. She had made her point, and now it was time for her to move on. "Thank you," she said quietly, her voice calm, but carrying the weight of everything that had been said in that brief exchange. She stood up slowly from the table, not waiting for any further words from the manager. She didn't need them. She had already said everything that needed to be said with her presence alone. As she walked toward the door, the staff parted silently to make way for her, their heads bowed slightly as if acknowledging her authority in the situation, and the woman didn't look back. She didn't need to. She knew that the lesson had been learned, and she could leave knowing that sometimes the greatest impact was made not through confrontation, but through quiet strength and grace. The door swung open as the woman stepped outside into the cool night air, her heels clicking softly on the pavement. As she walked away from the restaurant, she didn't look back. Even once she knew that the matter had been settled in its own way, she had said what needed to be said and had let the truth unfold on its own. She had taught a lesson not with anger or force, but with the quiet power of her presence, and now it was time to move on, to let the night continue without any further disruption. She felt no rush, no need to make a grand exit or to seek any kind of recognition. She knew that the impact of her actions would be felt long after she was gone. As she walked down the street, her mind was calm, her heart steady. She had learned long ago to take life's challenges in stride, to face adversity with grace and resilience. And this evening had been no different. It had been another lesson in patience, and in the quiet strength of holding one's ground. She thought about how often people were dismissed in the world simply because of how they looked or who they were, how easy it was for others to assume someone's worth based on superficial judgments. But she had proven that those assumptions meant nothing when faced with the truth of who a person really was. In the distance, she could hear the sounds of traffic, the hum of the city around her. But her mind was far from the noise. She was thinking of something else, something deeper. She thought about her son, and how he would have handled the situation, how he would have wanted her to handle it. He had always been the one who believed in confronting injustice head-on, in standing up and demanding respect for others. And she had always admired that about him, but tonight she had chosen a different path, one that required no shouting or grand gestures, but simply the quiet assertion of dignity and respect. She smiled to herself as she continued walking, her pace steady and not hurried. She had never been one for making a scene, never one to force her will upon others, but she knew that sometimes change happened not through confrontation, but through subtle shifts, through quiet moments where people were forced to face their own actions and reflect on their choices, and that was what had happened tonight. The waiter had been forced to reckon with the consequences of his behavior, and the staff had been reminded of the importance of respect for all people, no matter their background or appearance. She paused at the corner of the block, her thoughts drifting for a moment as she looked up at the stars in the sky above, the city lights dimming their brightness, but still offering a glimpse of something greater, something beyond the noise of the world. She had been part of something important tonight. She had made a difference, even if it was small, and she felt a quiet sense of satisfaction, knowing that the lesson would carry on in ways she would never see. The young waiter would remember her, the staff would remember the exchange, and perhaps it would change them just a little bit. As she turned the corner toward her apartment, she felt a sense of peace settle over her. She had done what she needed to do, and now it was time for rest, for reflection, for moving forward. The world would keep turning, the challenges would keep coming, but she knew that she was strong enough to face whatever came her way, because she had learned long ago that real power didn't come from the loudest voice or the strongest force, but from the quiet strength of standing firm in one's truth and letting that truth speak for itself. She reached her building and walked through the front door, her steps echoing in the quiet hallway, and as she made her way upstairs, she couldn't help but feel a sense of pride for what she had done tonight. Not for herself, but for the countless others who had been treated unfairly simply because of who they were. Tonight had been another small victory in the ongoing fight for respect, dignity, and equality, and though it hadn't been loud or dramatic, it had been enough. It had been everything. The next morning, the sun rose as usual, casting a soft golden light over the city streets, and the woman woke with the quiet peace that always followed a night of action. She moved slowly through her morning routine, the warmth of the water as she washed her face, the comforting scent of coffee as it brewed filling the kitchen, and as she sat down to breakfast, her thoughts drifted back to the events of the previous evening. She thought about the young waiter and how he had looked when she had finally made him face the consequences of his actions, how his eyes had shifted from defiance to uncertainty, then to remorse, and how his body had seemed to shrink under the weight of her gaze. She imagined that he would remember her for a long time to come, but more than that, she hoped that he would learn from this experience, that he would carry the lesson with him and apply it in every other situation that he faced. She knew that sometimes people needed to experience discomfort in order to grow, and that it was often in the moments of greatest shame or vulnerability that change began to take root. It wasn't about punishing anyone, it was about helping them realize the impact of their actions and seeing them learn from it. Her own life had been shaped by those kinds of moments where she had been forced to reflect on her own behavior, her own biases, and she had grown stronger for it. As she sipped her coffee, she wondered about the restaurant and what would happen there now. The manager had promised to address the issue with the staff, but she knew that talk could only go so far. The real change would come when the lesson was internalized, when the staff truly understood what it meant to treat every guest with dignity, no matter their background or appearance. She hoped that the manager would follow through with his words, but more than that, she hoped that this would become a turning point for the restaurant, that it would create a culture of respect that went beyond surface-level politeness and became something deeper, a place where people from all walks of life felt welcomed and valued, not just because of what they could afford or how they looked, but because they were human beings deserving of kindness and decency. She finished her breakfast and moved toward the window, looking out at the city below. The streets were bustling as usual. Cars honked in the distance and people hurried along the sidewalks. But there was a stillness in her heart, a quiet sense of accomplishment that filled her from within. She had done what she had set out to do. The young waiter had learned a valuable lesson, and the restaurant had been forced to confront its own biases. She had made an impact, even if it was a small one, and that was enough for her. She didn't need praise or recognition. She just needed to know that the right thing had been done, and that in some small way the world had shifted. As she gathered her things to leave for the day, she felt a sense of calm settle over her. She was ready for whatever came next. The world was full of challenges and injustices, and she knew that she would continue to face them head-on. But today she could move forward with the knowledge that she had done what she could to make a difference, that she had stood up for herself and for others without raising her voice or demanding attention. She had done it quietly with dignity and strength, and she knew that there was power in that. She left her apartment and walked down the street, her steps purposeful but unhurried. She wasn't in a rush. She wasn't trying to prove anything to anyone. She had already proven everything she needed to prove to herself. And as she moved through the city, she thought about all the other people out there who were fighting their own battles, and how sometimes the best way to make a difference wasn't with grand gestures or loud protests, but with quiet acts of defiance against the things that needed to be changed. Even in the smallest ways, she knew she had made her mark, and that was enough. A few weeks later, the woman received a call from the manager of the restaurant she had visited that night. It was a simple phone call, but one that held a lot of weight for her. He began with a polite greeting, but there was something different in his voice, something that told her this conversation would not be like the others. He thanked her again for bringing the issue to his attention and for handling it with such grace and dignity. He mentioned how much the staff had learned from that experience and how the incident had sparked a deeper conversation within the restaurant about the importance of respect and fairness. The woman listened quietly, letting him speak, knowing that he wasn't just saying words to appease her, but that there was a genuine shift happening within the establishment. She had hoped that this would be the case, but hearing it from him made it all the more real. He told her that he had spoken to every staff member individually and had organized a meeting to discuss the importance of inclusivity and the need to treat all guests equally, no matter their race or background. The manager's words were sincere, and the woman could tell that the staff was beginning to understand the weight of what had happened that night. They were starting to recognize their own biases and how their actions had contributed to a culture of exclusion. It was the kind of change that couldn't be rushed, the kind of transformation that happened over time, but she could feel the positive momentum building slowly with every conversation, every shift in mindset. It would take more than just a single meeting to undo years of ingrained attitudes, but this was a step in the right direction, and for that she felt a quiet sense of satisfaction. She had hoped that her presence that night would leave an impact, and now she knew it had. The message was getting through, and it was being taken seriously. As the conversation continued, the manager told her about a new initiative the restaurant had started to ensure that every guest felt seen and valued. They had implemented a training program focused on diversity and inclusion and were working with outside organizations to ensure they were following best practices in hospitality and respect. It was encouraging to hear that they were not only addressing the immediate issue, but were taking steps to make lasting changes that would have a ripple effect beyond just the one night. The woman felt a surge of hope as she realized that her small act of standing up had contributed to something much larger than she had imagined. When the manager finished speaking, he thanked her once more for her patience and understanding. He told her that the restaurant was committed to making sure something like that would never happen again. He also invited her to visit again whenever she felt ready and promised that she would be treated with the respect she deserved whenever she walked through their doors. The woman thanked him, but it wasn't necessary to go over the details again. She had already made her peace with the situation. The change that had come was more than enough for her. She had already done her part. The work was now in the hands of the restaurant and its staff, and she trusted that they would continue on the path toward becoming a better place for everyone. She ended the call with a sense of calm, knowing that the lesson had been learned, and that change was underway. She didn't need to see it firsthand to know that it was happening, because sometimes the impact of an action ripples out in ways we can't always see immediately, but we trust that it's there. As she hung up the phone, she felt a quiet contentment settle in her heart, and she realized that this was what she had wanted all along, not for her own satisfaction or recognition, but for a change that would benefit others, and she knew that it had started that night when she had made the decision to stand firm, not for herself, but for something greater than her personal experience, and she was at peace with that. A month later, the woman sat in her favorite chair by the window watching the city bustle outside as the sun dipped lower in the sky. She had returned to her quiet life after the events at the restaurant, but something had changed inside of her. The events had not only shifted the atmosphere in the restaurant, but they had planted a seed within her, something she hadn't realized she needed until now. She felt a quiet sense of pride, but also a new sense of responsibility, as if the small act of standing up for what was right had unlocked something in her that had always been there but hadn't been fully realized. She thought about the world around her, the constant noise, the endless rush of people moving in every direction, chasing after success or status or something they could never quite define. But she had always found peace in the simple moments, the small acts of kindness, the quiet conversations that happened when no one was watching. She knew that real change didn't always come from grand gestures, but from the everyday choices people made, the way they treated each other, the way they chose to see one another not as strangers, but as fellow human beings deserving of respect and dignity. She had done something small that night, but it had created a ripple that would continue long after the restaurant returned to normal. She had set an example without even trying to teach anyone, but herself, the lesson that her actions mattered, that standing firm for what was right, even when it wasn't easy, could change the course of something bigger than herself. And that sometimes the most important victories were the quiet ones, the ones that happened without applause or recognition, but instead in the hearts of those who had learned from the experience. As she sat there lost in thought, her phone rang and she glanced down at the screen. Her son's name appeared. She smiled and picked up the call. "Hey Mom," he said with his usual warmth. "How are you?" "I'm good," she replied, her voice calm and steady. "Just thinking a bit. You know how it is." He laughed softly. "Of course I do. But what are you thinking about?" She paused for a moment, thinking of the words to say, not wanting to burden him with too much, but knowing that this moment was the right time to share just a little bit of what had been on her heart. "I was thinking about the night at that restaurant," she said quietly, "and how sometimes small actions can change everything." He was silent for a moment before responding. "I remember you telling me about it," he said, "and I've been thinking about it too." He paused again and added, "Mom, I'm proud of you. It wasn't just about standing up for yourself. It was about standing up for all of us, for everyone who's ever been overlooked or dismissed, and that's something that doesn't go unnoticed." She smiled softly, feeling a warmth spread through her chest. Those words meant more to her than anything else could, because they came from him, because he understood it wasn't about the big gestures or the public praise. It was about standing firm in the face of something wrong and doing what needed to be done. She thanked him quietly, knowing that the lesson had already been passed on. It wasn't just something she had taught him, it was something they both now carried with them. It was a reminder that the world could be changed, not by the loudest voice or the most powerful, but by those who chose to act with integrity and quiet strength every day. As she ended the call, she felt a deep sense of peace settle over her, like a warm blanket around her heart. She had done what she could in that moment, and now it was time to move forward, knowing that the ripples of her actions would continue to spread long after the waves had subsided. The world was still filled with challenges, but she had found her own quiet way of making a difference, and that was enough.